Hi everybody, I'm Diya. I'm the new Associate Curator of Exhibitions here at the Museum of Danish America.
Where did you even hear about us?
I found it on a job postings website, just searching all the museum jobs, and this one peeled. Been trying to move to Iowa, third time's the charm.
Hold up. Why would you want to move to Iowa?
I don't know. I nearly went to undergrad here, applied for a job in a different field after undergrad, and I wanted to change from the city life. I like farming and all that, so I was voted most likely to go off the grid my freshman year of college, so I've almost succeeded. This is as close to success as I can get while still having access to television.
Yes. Unfortunately, Elkhorn has electricity and internet utilities.
I like having running water. It's kind of a bare minimum.
You mentioned your undergrad. What did you do for your undergrad and where?
So I went to Washington University in St. Louis. I studied environmental policy and then added art history as my second major and global health and the environment as my minor. I thought I was going into environmental policy, worked in that field for a while, then realized it was not for me, so I returned to grad school for technical art history. Moved to Scotland for that. So I spent a year of my life living there, eating shortbread, watching puffins, and getting a degree, of course.
So environmental policy with art history. Why did you choose to tag on art history?
I always enjoyed it when I was younger. I grew up kind of with books on art history. My grandmother is a huge art person, so I took a few classes just thinking, oh, this will be fun. It'll cover some of my gen ed requirements, and pretty soon 2 classes turned into a major, which turned into a thesis, which I thought would, end my fun little experiment, but clearly it didn't. I'm still here.
It was just the gateway.
Pretty much. I enjoyed it too much to let it go.
How did you end up in Scotland?
I had studied abroad in Scotland during undergrad, and so when I applied to grad school, I caused my parents a lot of stress by only applying to 2 Scottish universities for it. Apart from the fact that they just have a really interesting art collection in Glasgow in this case, it was also a really unique program because technical art history is a growing field that's not quite standard art history, not quite conservation, so it was a chance to explore something a little bit different in the world of art history.
Right, so that's the question. What is technical art history?
So technical art history is the study of the materials and techniques of art. And it includes both historical studies, so looking at sources, whether that's artists' own writings, treatises, letters, receipts. There's a whole bunch of historical sources that give us information. And then there's also the scientific side of it, which is basically, I described it a little bit like the first year of a conservation degree. So understanding the materials present by X-rays, infrared analysis, paint sampling, and a variety of other scientific techniques.
Can you give an example of how that would be applied? Like, what would you do with that?
So, for example, in my thesis, which is 253 pages for anyone who's really bored, I studied a specific portrait by Sir Godfrey Neller, who's a British portrait artist. He worked through several kings in the Stuart dynasty and then into the Hanoverians. And he was really, really prolific, but he's not really much in the last 40 years almost. So I was doing a technical analysis of his portrait, and one of the things that I was able to look at was study layers of his painting. So starting with the first layer, like applied directly to the canvas, and how he built it up to prepare for that final layer of painting, which is the portrait that you see. Here's the portrait in question. As you can see, I bookmarked this for easy hunting. Supposedly it's the last painting he did before he died. This is what the paint sample looks like once it gets embedded and polished. And so you can start to see that there are distinctive layers that get built up, and only that very, very thin topmost layer is pretty much the painted layer that we see.
So how do you get a paint sample? You can just take a chunk off a painting?
It's a very, very, very tiny sample. We use a scalpel and a magnifying glass. This is from a sculpture, so it's a little bit different, but this is a sculpture I studied, and at the bottom of one of these were used for experimentation. It's so tiny you can barely see it, but at the very bottom, basically using a magnifying glass and a scalpel, you can take off a tiny, tiny, tiny chunk.
And not in an important part of the painting, I would guess?
So it depends. Trained conservation professionals could do it from a more central location, but even then, usually you try and find areas of existing damage. So if there's already some cracking on the painting, it's usually a little bit safer to take it from there. In my case, we stuck to the exterior of the painting because there were no significant areas of damage in the center. So took one sample from the bottom of his robe and one sample from the background, which all gets documented in a sample site diagram.
So what all can a sample tell you? What do you learn from that?
So there's a few things you learn from samples. The first and perhaps the most significant one is simply how many layers were used. So how was the painting prepared, essentially? Usually canvases are, they're covered in a layer, especially in this era, of size, which was often rabbit skin glue, and then grounds and priming. And basically the purpose of that was to create a flat surface, because obviously canvas with the weave is not fully flat. So by creating those layers, it allowed for a flat surface, and also by changing the color of the topmost layer, you could affect the colors in the final painting. For example, because he used a really, really bright white top layer here, it actually it's actually more of a grayish tone. But in some of the close-ups of his ear or his eyes, you can see hints of this coming through, and it was used as an element in flesh painting. The other thing you can tell is the materials that are present. So that's done in a variety of really fun ways. One is understanding not even pigments, but binders. So whenever you have a pigment, it usually, obviously today we get nice acrylic paints, but in the old days you used to get it in powdered form. This is a pigment made of buckthorn berries that I made myself. I actually have pictures of me dying in the lab making this if you want any of those.
Dying in the lab. That sounds dramatic.
Yeah, because there was a bit of a struggle, and we broke 3 coffee filters trying to make this. And so I had a little lie down in the lab. We had an 8-hour lab session and it still wasn't done. But this, you would take some of the pigment and then grind it with, usually it was often in oils, so like linseed oil was perhaps the most common. As time went on, some artists like to incorporate new fun things like spermaceti wax, which comes from whales, Resins were sometimes used, but that's more 19th century. But as a result, one thing that you can do to test for binders is use stains, which fluoresce for proteins. So, for example, there's some fun fluorescence here, which indicated that there was protein in it, which means it could have been egg, or possibly some of the rabbit skin glue, because oil would not have proteins that fluoresce for this. So this is using a method called SEM-EDX, which is scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive microanalysis, I believe.
What kind of equipment are we talking here?
We borrowed this from the geology department, so it's often used for rocks. But what's really interesting about this is you can basically create maps of the sample for different elements. And because we know the chemical composition for different elements, that gives us a good sense of what could be there. So aluminum, this is just it's a carbon-coated thing, which is why that's red. Silicone, which is often glass particles are sometimes found in it. Lead. Back in the days before we knew lead was toxic, lead appears quite frequently in paints. Lead white and red lead are very common. Calcium, which is commonly found in chalk, or sometimes there's a pigment called bone black, which is exactly what it sounds like. Iron, barium, which is a trace element.
Do you think he was able to pick this product up off a store shelf, or do you think that was like hand mixed?
It was all hand mixed. So there were people who specialized in grinding pigments, especially as time went on and you see the rise of big color companies. But usually you would still have to grind the pigment yourself and add in the oil or other binder to get it to the consistency that you want, and then mix all the colors yourself.
What other source materials were you able to use besides the sample?
Yeah, so we did take infrared images and X-ray images of it, which I do have. Unfortunately, in this case, it doesn't tell you a whole lot. So this is what an infrared image looks like. The nice thing about infrared is that in other cases, what it would tell you is often the presence of an underdrawing. So a lot of artists would use a carbon black based material like charcoal or something like that to sketch out what they were going to draw. In the case of Godfrey Neller, he very rarely did that. And sometimes it was done in kind of a brown ink that the material will not be picked up by infrared imaging. So unfortunately, this is perhaps not the most exciting infrared image I could show you, but it was consistent with what we would expect from Godfrey Neller. Infrared images are also really good because when you do have that underdrawing, you can tell if the artist made changes to their work. Also, you can sometimes tell, if the underdrawing is very, very precise and very detailed, that's sometimes an indication that it's a copy. If there are no changes, if it was like a very sure hand, those are sometimes indications that it was not an original, because in a lot of the originals you'll see a little more kind of sketching out of areas, so to speak, and there's more likelihood of alterations happening between the sketch and the finished product. And then this is what the X-ray looked like. Again, unfortunately, I can't share with you a more exciting X-ray. One of my friends in the program found an entire separate portrait underneath the portrait that she was studying. So that's one of the exciting things about X-rays, is that sometimes you get surprises. What you get here, some nails, the stretcher that it's on, and the vaguest sense of a face. I mainly use this for counting the weave. because that can give you a sense of, is it a very coarse canvas, is it a very fine canvas, and the general quality of it. Ultimately, most X-rays are not that exciting. The ones that make the news are the ones that, they find an entire separate portrait underneath it, or something like that. Because that's one of the uses of technical art history, is that this is the more sort of standard day-to-day stuff in understanding how artists worked and informing conservation, but it's also used in the real versus fake side of research, because if you find a pigment that was not developed until the 1900s, and the painting is supposedly from the 1600s, it's a pretty good way of understanding that might be a modern day forgery. So another thing, and this is something that if you want to dabble a little bit in technical art history at home, one thing that we look at to kind of understand how painters work is taking elements of their painting and comparing it across pieces. So, for example, because Godfrey Neller is primarily working in portraits, I have pages. I don't want to admit how many miles I traveled and how many paintings by him I have seen. And these aren't even all the paintings that I've seen. These are all the paintings that were either put at a height that I could photograph or made accessible to me. But yeah, so you can kind of trace it, and it helps to understand how he painted, and also if something is glaringly different, it kind of raises a red flag. But in his case, all of them are relatively similar, but he also had a studio, so there were other artists working for him, so sometimes you'll see minor differences, which could just be because a different artist did it. Supposedly he could see, I think, seven sitters in a day, which is maybe true, but that would be a very rapid pace of portrait production. But also would explain why he was so prolific during that time. Although, after a certain point, all ears look the same. I will admit that. When there are two versions of the same painting that both come from the same artist's studio, you can take a tracing. So this was done by printing large versions of both paintings. I was not going to try and do this directly on a painting that is worth more than I am. And then I used just the plastic sheet that you can buy to keep papers in, cut it in half, and then trace the features in Sharpie. And then by putting them one over the other, I could tell that they likely were using patterns as a way to transfer, because in those days, sometimes you would make a portrait of somebody and a few other people would want one too. So you would have to be able to make copies, especially when you're doing royal portraits, because who doesn't want a portrait of the king in their house to show loyalty? It's a good way to understand how his studio might have made copies and been able to produce so many portraits. Like I said, there's 253 pages in here. Basically, it was understanding how Godfrey Neller worked. The question I was trying to answer was, what were the methods and techniques used in creating the portrait of John Arbuthnot, and how does that relate to the work Godfrey Neller did? So, for example, using 3 layers of kind of preparatory layers before he put the final paint layer was relatively unique, and I found that was actually the case in many of his other paintings, which is a useful thing to know for kind of future analysis, that's kind of I wouldn't say a hallmark, but at least a noteworthy thing about his practice, so that if in the future other people are doing technical analysis and they see that, they know that that's not uncommon for him and probably lends more weight to it being by him or a studio.
So will you apply any of that here?
Hopefully, eventually. Right now, I've been working on our upcoming Art Nouveau porcelain show, which opens October 2nd. But yeah, there are some interesting historical Danish and technical art history overlaps with recipe books and such. But at the time being, that'll have to be put on the back burner. So what I've been doing is basically getting ready for this. So that included picking up the pieces from the collector, and then we go through the process of doing condition reports, which all goes through Angela. And then I get to draft things like the brochure and all the wall panels and object labels, which then get reviewed by everybody. And this is currently my kind of opening layout attempts. It's not, this is a very early attempt, but we're slowly doing drafts for that, so that when we have to move it in, there's a plan in place for where everything will go. The goal will be to get everything up there, get everything in place, and then all we have to do is put the porcelain in its case, seal the case, lock it, and step away. and hands off after that. We're all doing 6-foot distancing from each other, but ideal world like 6-foot distancing from porcelain too, because these are so unbelievably fragile. And just ceramics in general are very stressful for those of us like myself that are very clumsy.
So another thing that I've been working on since getting here is the core exhibit rotation. So we shift around both the artifacts and the panels about every year or so. So before I arrived, the previous intern, I believe, had already worked on writing up everything, and she put out the artifacts. However, the panels were still to be done, so those will be coming soon. They'll be sent off to print, and then they will be hung up here. And they should be here by the end of the month. We rotate so that we can showcase new Danish American stories, as well as new objects from our collection that otherwise you may not get to see on display while you're here.
So one of the most expensive pigments was Ultramarine, which is ground up lapis. And so it could only be brought in from the Middle East. And so as a result, it was more expensive than gold. And depending on the author, there's some I think one of them says it can only be ground because, of course, you get the stones and you have to grind it to a powder. I think one of them said it should only be ground by unmarried women.
Of course. Let's add some ceremony to this.
Exactly. Future job goals, I guess. Grinding. And it creates a beautiful blue color that sometimes is seen, especially medieval, Renaissance, Baroque. It'll appear, especially religious paintings. It was a great way to remind everybody of how holy somebody was, or how important if it was in a portrait, because if you were the person paying for that portrait and you could afford ultramarine, it was a great way to show that you were rich. Other interesting ones are Leonardo Da Vinci, because I wrote a paper on his use of aloe, or his suggested use of aloe, but he also recommended that you use urine as part of a preparatory layer. Not sure how that would have worked out. Not sure if he even ever did it, because that's the other thing about using historical sources, is artists are really great at writing a bunch of things down. And you're never sure if they actually did it, because you're not sure if this is based on their own experiments or just a thought that they had. And sometimes, in certain cases, artists may not have wanted to divulge the full secrets of their practice. So it takes a lot of weeding out to understand kind of what is properly based in truth, what is complete honesty, and what just might be made up.
Is this something you could do at home? Like, what are some easy pigments or paints to make?
So you can, in fact, do some. So you can do some natural dyes at home. There is a way to get dyes out of your vegetables. I'm not an expert in this by any means, but you can do sort of home tie-dye with that. If you want to make a little more fancy pigments at home, the easiest one is probably Verdigris, because it's a copper-based pigment, and essentially to create it, you need pure copper and you need acid. Because if you've ever noticed when copper rusts, it goes slightly green. So that's a fun home experiment, is creating verdigris, because you're basically trying to make that reaction happen a lot faster than it would normally. Some white vinegar, stick as pure of a piece of copper as you can find in it, and yeah, you'll get verdigris. Or, if you have some of your grandmother's old jewelry, you could crush some lapis and make your own jewelry.
No, do not do that.
Yeah, I don't think my grandmother would be happy if her ring went missing.
Yeah,
just
or
the name of art.
If this is something that could be significant to a Danish American museum, do not crush that.
Do not use it unless it was already headed for the trash.
True.
Welcome to the property.
What is in here? What is this?
So this is the prep room, where basically all the technical side of exhibition work gets done. So over here on this table is the label making station, as well as a stray exhibit case. But basically whenever we're making our little wall labels that are mounted on foam core, they get made right over here, higher pieces, and this lovely, I actually don't know what the name of this is. It's a dry mounting laminating press. We make things every day, despite the fact that I've used this multiple times. I'm just a little label maker. Here we've got all our exhibit cases, mannequins, whatever we have any kind of clothing stands, book stands. We've got little holders for brochures, other things. We've got doll stands as well. We also keep some of our traveling exhibits here, because even after they've come off display, some of them are still available for other institutions to be able to borrow. So, for example, we have Dave's Pioneer traveling exhibit up here, the sport exhibit. And so those are always available for other institutions who might want to put them on display. That's exciting. This one I have very little to do with. Of course, social distancing, unfortunately, a few seating arrangements have to find new homes. So their home is with me, which is nice. After a nice long day of label making, I have a place to come sit in here. Extraction shelf with more types of nails and screws and hooks that I knew existed about 3 months ago. So yeah, whenever we're doing anything picture hanging related, we've got an entire wall of options here. And then I got to use the power drill for the first time about a week ago, which was very exciting. I'm willing to expand my skills quite a bit. I'm not sure anybody's using doing carpentry quite yet.
Do you have a favorite medium of art?
I do enjoy painting, as cliche as that is, but I am growing more and more fond of porcelain, which is not necessarily something I thought I would say, but working on this exhibition and researching it has made me appreciate a lot more than I did before, especially when the things in question are like fish figurines and such that you wouldn't really associate with porcelain.
Right. A lot of people think porcelain is vases.
Right.
Maybe plates and plaques. But we have more than that.
Exactly. In this exhibition, there are even like hat pins and belt buckles, things that definitely you would not think of when you think of porcelain.
You and I talk a lot about food. What's your favorite food? What would you say? Like a cuisine, a flavor?
All foods. I'm not a very picky person when it comes to food. I do like my food to have spices, preferably a lot of them. So I do gravitate towards like Thai food. I do love good tacos. So if anybody has taco recommendations in like a 60-mile radius of Elkhorn, I will happily take it. When I'm cooking at home, I cook a lot of Mexican food for myself, but I've been experimenting more. So, yeah, but I'll eat almost anything, especially if it's chili peppers.
What food do you hate, like, off the table?
I don't eat seafood.
What?
Yeah, I stopped eating seafood when I was like 6 years old because I went to the aquarium and they told me about overfishing, and I was too young to understand that you can buy like sustainably caught seafood. And now just 20 years later, I just don't have any taste for it anymore. Also, Brussels sprouts.
What? Diya.
I will only eat Brussels sprouts if they are covered in sriracha, and therefore I cannot taste the Brussels sprout. I'm only tasting sriracha.
Are you an artist yourself?
Not really. I like to draw a little bit, and I'm not a very good painter at all. I used to make jewelry when I was younger. Made a lot of earrings and such, but I wouldn't say I'm a great artist. I'm just a hobby artist. But yeah, definitely not entering any competitions for my stick figures.
So besides, do you have a favorite time period or anything you studied that is especially resonant with you?
I'm all over the board. I like ancient things like Neolithic, Roman, that sort of settlements are really interesting to me. But I'm also really fascinated by World War I and II because I'm very interested in naval history and sea warfare. So I just find that time period fascinating for that side of history.
Okay, we also have like a prairie park. What's your favorite element of that?
I really love seeing the birds, and so far I've been lucky enough to spot a few woodpeckers going through. Being an environmental policy major, obviously the prairie is just really interesting to me from kind of a recreating natural spaces that would have existed here years ago. But it's also just really interesting as a community gathering space and a multi-use space. I do love birds, so it's always exciting when I see that little red head of a woodpecker flying around.
What do you do for fun?
So I watch a lot of sports. I cook, and right now I am studying Egyptian hieroglyphs for fun with a 600-page book. I'm only on lesson 3, but yeah, I can now write basic sentences about scribes going downstream in a boat. It's mostly just like a childhood dream. I grew up obsessed with ancient Egypt, and so
during quarantine, I had nothing better to do with my time, so I took a mini online course on it. And then when I moved here, I decided to kind of pick up where I left off and actually try it more seriously.
Do you speak any other languages besides English?
I studied German for a while, so I can understand it. I don't like speaking it because I inevitably forget most of my vocab and how to conjugate verbs. I also took a little bit of Swedish, so I do understand bits and pieces of that as well, which has been really interesting with Danish because I see a little bit of German and a little bit of Swedish, so I've understood more of it than I thought I would be able to.
So you live in Elkhorn now.
Yes.
But where else have you lived? Where did you come from?
I was born in Austin when my family moved up to the Binghamton area in New York. Then we moved to Pittsburgh. I went to college in St. Louis, spent a summer up in St. Cloud, about an hour outside Minneapolis. After graduation, I moved to Billings, Montana for work for a little bit, and then back to Pittsburgh. Also during undergrad, I briefly spent 6 months living in Edinburgh. And then after returning to Pittsburgh, I eventually went to grad school in Glasgow, back to Pittsburgh, and then over to Elkhorn, which is somewhere in this space, unfortunately, poorly labeled area of the map. Elkhorn has been wonderful so far. Apart from Elkhorn, obviously Pittsburgh is my hometown, so I'll always have a soft spot for it. But I did really enjoy living in Glasgow because it's really good food, really nice people. I lived a block away from a cheesemonger, so it was pretty much my ideal life.
Are you going to get any pets here in Elkhorn?
Hopefully I'll be able to bring Flora down with me. That's my dog's name. She's currently with my parents because I can't have dogs at my rental, but fingers crossed that eventually either they'll let me or I'll be able to find a place that will allow me to have her, because I do miss her. I will also happily, anytime somebody says that they have a dog, I pretty much will show up. That's the easiest way to bribe me places, is promise me a dog or cheese.